Hello, all my classics friends. It's a Monday afternoon, and we're going to do Plato today. So we're going to dive into it as quickly as possible. I'm in my living room today, so welcome in. Don't cough on anything. Don't touch anything. Um, Sorry, I know. Um, I did make up a COVID joke the other day, so I'm going to tell it to you. Um, what do you call it when your professor has to post lectures online for you to watch? A co-video. Okay, so today we're doing Plato. Plato was born in 427, dies in 347. The 427 date is somewhat disputed among scholars, but it's, you know, no, it's some say 424 or 425, but it doesn't really matter all that much. Although I prefer the date 427 because it's a neat um, point for talking about the Republic, which is what we're going to talk about today, and then also again in the next lecture, which is to say that the Republic itself, which is a dialogue um, or an argument. So what is known in Greek is an elenchus, right? Which in its broadest sense means a philosophical dialogue or dispute. And all of Plato's works are, I should say, almost all of Plato's works are in this format. Um, Certainly, all the works that are not disputed with respect to authorship are in this format. So that's what we're going to be talking about, dialogue today. So Elenchus is a philosophical dialogue. So back to 427. That's interesting from a couple of perspectives. First of all, if you have been uh, keeping up with what we've been talking about over the course of the semester, you will remember that this is just a few years into the Peloponnesian War, and even just a year or so after the final abatement of the plague. Um, and so it's a significant year for Athenians and in Athenian history. Um, so let me back up here so that I can make sure I'm being clear about this. Um, most of, well, I think almost all, well, I can't think of an example to the contrary, but the majority of Plato's dialogues are not set during his lifetime. They're set in the prior century, in the 400s, and many of them even before Plato was born. Which brings us to Socrates. We remember Socrates from the clouds. Um, so we're going to be talking, one of the things we're going to be looking at today are the two Socrateses, so to speak. Aristophanes' Socrates from the clouds, and Plato's Socrates from the Republic, because they're different kinds of characters. Um, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Let me think what else I have to say by way of simple background here. In the Platonic dialogue, they're normally presented in the format of Socrates in conversation with one or more individuals, in which they try to explore, in some dialogues, a single subject, in other dialogues, multiple subjects. Okay, so when we one thing that we have to remember here now is I'm going to talk just for a second about historical Socrates. Um, Socrates, we don't we know all we know about Socrates comes from other writers. Because if we believe what Plato has Socrates says, Socrates believed that writing was the enemy of knowledge, which means that as soon as you write something down, you don't have to know it anymore because you know where you can find that information later. I talked a little bit about this when we did Homer and the oral epic tradition, and I used the example of the cell phone where you put all your numbers into the cell phone. You lose your cell phone, you lose all the numbers. You have nothing in memory, nothing memorized. And memory is a big theme in Socrates. If it becomes relevant, I'll talk a little bit about that. It's memory as it is related to knowledge. But anyway, I don't want to go down that uh, pathway just yet. We need to do some more fundamental things. Plato is, of course, our main source for information about Socrates because Plato's writings became central to the practice of philosophy in the European tradition. There's tons of Plato that survives. His survival rate is compared to an author like Sophocles or compared to a tradition like the epic tradition. It's quite remarkable how much of Plato survives. There's a reason for that, um, which I won't get into now, I promise, because I don't want this to go on for too long. So maybe I'll talk about that at some other point. Um, so yeah, when we talk about the Socrates from Aristophanes, we know we're dealing with a literary construct. We know he's a character, right? Yes, Socrates was a real person, and he was a kind of a known figure in Athens amongst a certain class of people. And so he's a convenient kind of catch-all for lots of different philosophical ideas. Now, we've already gone over this, so I won't go into it too deeply, but just to reiterate briefly, Aristophanes takes a whole bunch of different ideas from other philosophers, makes them totally ridiculous, and attributes them to Socrates. So the Socrates in the clouds can't be considered an accurate portrayal of the actual historical Socrates. What about Plato? Plato's portrayal of Socrates has tended over the centuries, actually at this stage millennia, to be more reflective of the actual historical Socrates himself. Why is that? That's because Plato is writing serious philosophy. He's not writing comedy, therefore must be adhering to the facts. But that is not widely, or that has come under dispute, shall we say, over the last few decades. Um, Scholars have begun to question the accuracy of the portrayal of Socrates in Plato. And the cause for that is because when you look at the dialogues of Plato, the actual philosophy that he has Socrates discussing in the dialogues changes over time. So Plato's dialogues are generally separated into early dialogues, middle dialogues, and late period dialogues. The Republic falls probably towards the end of the middle period or beginning of the late period. And it's usually attributed to about the year 375, though I would not have any problems with arguments that put it in the 360s. But we'll use 375 as our working date today. The early, you can, and the way that we make the judgment about early, late, and middle dialogues is there's kind of two factors that are involved here. One, the first factor is the narrative complexity of the dialogue, which is to say that some of Plato's dialogues they're just speaking parts. Socrates, colon, yada yada. Meno, colon, yada yada. Socrates, colon, yada yada. There's no narrative fleshing out. It reads like the way that you would read a play, basically, more or less, with just lines attributed to each of the Socrates and then each of his, let me give you this word, each of his interlocutors. An interlocutor, it looks like a fancy word. It's not really a fancy word. It just simply means the people who are involved. An interlocutor is somebody who was involved in the conversation with Socrates. So we talk about Socrates when we talk about Plato's dialogues. We talk about Socrates, and then with any specific dialogues, we identify who his interlocutors are, which is just to say the other characters, right? So the early dialogues are very, again, narratively simple in the sense that there's no narrative description, there's no narrator who tells you about where they are or what they're doing or what their surroundings look like or anything like that. It's just the lines of discussion. When we get into the middle period and then into the late period, you begin to see a lot more narrative detail happening. So the Republic, you've read book 1 of the Republic, and you can see there that there's a narrator who tells us things, and then there's the conversation, but that conversation is set in different places. It begins at the port of the Piraeus, and then Socrates and his friend Glaucon, his friend, I call him friend, which I think is probably what Socrates would have called him, something more like a pupil, though we'll talk about that in just a second. So who is this character Glaucon that we meet in Book 1 of the Republic? And in fact, he will remain the main interlocutor throughout the dialogue. Glaucon was a real person. In fact, Glaucon was Plato's older brother. So there you go. So they start off walking back. They're coming back from a religious festival that they'd been attending. And as they are walking back, they get tracked down. They get tracked down by a young man who insists that they come back to his house in order to. His name is Polemarchos. We'll come back to him in just a second. He insists that he comes back to the house because his dad, Cephalus, is old and can't go. So Athens sits up on top of a hill. Their port, called the Piraeus, sits down at the bottom of the hill, where the harbor is, where the seashore is. And the Athenians built a road from the Piraeus up to Athens, and it was actually enclosed within the walls, the protective walls of the city itself. So it was a part of the city of Athens, just a little bit away from it. So what Polemarchos says is that his dad is now too weak to walk up to the city to talk with Socrates, and he misses conversations with Socrates. So can Socrates come and join the conversation at Cephalus' house? So they go to Cephalus' house. All of this is, I'm going to get into the conversation in just a moment, but all of this is just by way of saying that you can see that there is a greater sense of narrative detail here. We're told about where they are. We're told about what they were doing outside of the actual philosophy contained in the conversation itself. So that's one factor in identifying early dialogues from later dialogues. It's generally thought by scholars that the dialogues that have the greater narrative content are later, and the ones that are more bare bones are earlier. That's one thing. Okay, so that's one argument, and it's a good argument. I accept it. But there's another argument that's even better for the way that we arrange Plato's dialogues in terms of their chronology, and that has to do with the actual philosophy of them. When you look at the early dialogues, you tend to see, generally speaking, single subjects discussed, and oftentimes coming to no conclusion at all. They can't figure out the answer to what they're after. Now, this will become a theme that we'll return to, not today, but in the next lecture. This is called aporia. So aporia is a state of confusion. It's when you can't arrive at an answer to a problem that you're thinking of. So I'm trying to keep the glare down here. Let's see the best angle. There we go. It's related. It's also related to the word for blindness. So, when you can't figure out the answer to whatever philosophical question you're seeking the answer to. The early dialogues, as I said, or what we think of as the early dialogues, tend to deal with, like I said, a single issue at one time, and often end without coming to a definitive answer to that question. Uh, but when you get into the more kind of evolved dialogues, uh, the questions are more complicated and the answers are more complicated. Now, you have to remember, Socrates dies in 399. Plato doesn't begin writing these dialogues probably not until the middle of the 390s, 380s, 370s. Um, so these are not okay. I'll put it as bluntly as I can. The philosophy that is contained in Plato that is put in the mouth of Socrates is by and large Plato's philosophy, not Socrates' philosophy. Plato borrows Socrates' teaching technique, which was to argue and have conversation, but he puts his own ideas, he wraps his own ideas up in them. So again, I'm going to make a generalization here. In the early dialogues, it is generally accepted that what we are seeing in those dialogues is an accurate portrayal of Socrates as he taught in his teaching method, the Elenchus, and also accurate in the types of things that he talked about or wanted to talk about with his fellow Athenians. But as we get deeper into Plato's career, and the Republic falls under this category, Socrates has become more of a literary character, more of a mouthpiece for Plato's developing philosophy than anything that Socrates himself might ever have taught. So for that reason, when we look at the portrayal in Aristophanes and Plato of Socrates, that's why I put Socrates in quotation marks. Okay, so we've got two Socrates that we have to deal with here, both of whom are, in a general sense, literary constructs, characters, rather than, as I mentioned, an accurate portrayal. But that doesn't stop Plato from addressing, even in the Republic and the later dialogues, certain events in historical Socrates' life. One of those events is, of course, his trial and his execution. So we're going to have to back up here, refresh a little bit of history. Socrates was himself not attached to material possessions. This is something that is true both in Aristophanes. While Aristophanes tries to make him out to be something of a grifter, but he's still, shabby and poorly dressed, even in the clouds. That's how we recognize him as one of the ways that we recognize him as Socrates as an audience, because that apparently was true in real life. I forget what I was going to say now. Start talking about Socrates, who was famously short and bald and ugly, and was not exceptionally keen on maintaining his personal hygiene. There's a passage in another dialogue called the Symposium, which is really cool. A symposium is a drinking party, and so all the conversation happens as everyone gets drunker and drunker. In that play, when Socrates finally arrives at the drinking party, one of the guests says to him, "Socrates, what's the deal? You took a bath. You're wearing shoes. What's the occasion?" So definitely in both instances, both Aristophanes and in Plato, we get this portrayal of Socrates as somebody who was unconcerned with material things. I'll come back to that in just a moment when we start the dialogue proper. But there are also things that Aristophanes has in his comic character of Socrates that Plato tries to react against with his philosophical portrayal of Socrates. So, what are these things? Well, in order to discuss these things, we kind of have to go back a little bit. Socrates he was very popular with young men of means, wealthy young men who liked to follow him around, and either listen in on or take part in the various philosophical conversations Socrates would have. Um, but Socrates himself never had a school as such. Whereas, as we know, um, uh, Aristophanes, or as we remember from the Clouds, Aristophanes portrays Socrates as a sophist. And the sophists, it's a word you should have in your notes already. Don't worry, I'm going to put that back up in just a moment. Remember, the sophists were teachers, many of whom were not Athenian, some of whom were Athenian, but they came to Athens and they set up schools and expected to be paid. They expected tuition to be paid, more or less. But in Plato, the Socrates he presents us is somebody who did not have a formal school, never set up a formal school. Plato will later on. Maybe I'll talk about that in the next lecture. So in Aristophanes, because Socrates is presented as a sophist, that means he teaches for money. Plato does not want us to think that Socrates teaches for money. He wants us to think that Socrates teaches for the pursuit of pure knowledge in its own right. Cool. But the problem that this presented historically was that a lot of those young men who were known to associate with Socrates throughout the 440s and 430s went on, as young men were expected to do in Athens, went on to positions of political prominence. And in the second phase of the Peloponnesian War, we've talked about this already, but the Athenian politicians completely mismanaged the state's affairs, oftentimes for the short-term benefit of lining their own pockets, of profiting off the war itself, and oftentimes because they just weren't all that smart. And so Athens goes through, when we get into the 4-aughts, beginning about the year 411 and then into the 4-aughts, there's a lot of political turmoil in Athens. There's a faction of people who want to get rid of the democracy because they feel that the democracy has led Athens into an untenable position with respect to the war itself. That electing leaders is not effective because the people, as a collective whole, are too dumb to know who their best leader should be. So these people want to put an oligarchy in. And then there's the other faction of people who are still in favor of the democracy. These things, I don't want to say this is a 100% rule, but these things did tend to be divided along class lines. It won't surprise you to know that many of the people who wanted to get rid of the democracy and put an oligarchy in were rich people. And many of the people who were on the side of the democracy were from what we would now call middle class or working class. Again, I don't like using those terms. Those terms aren't perfect for understanding the ancient Greek world. The way that their society was set up does not map exactly onto the way that our society is set up, but they're convenient enough for our purposes today. So Athens ends up, so they actually overthrow the democracy for a short period of time and put an oligarchy in, but after Athens loses the war, and after Sparta's attentions turn elsewhere, away from Athens, Athens reinstitutes the democracy. This is in 401 BCE. And so what happens in Athens is there's a sense of I suppose I'd call it what the fuckness. what just happened? How did we lose this war? We won the first part of the war, and then we lost the second part, and now our city walls have been destroyed, and our navy has been destroyed, and we're way poorer than we were 20 years ago. So how did this happen? What happened? And so they started looking around, and as often happens in political collectives during times of crisis or right after times of crisis, you got to find someone to blame. So how did they get there? Well, they got there because their political leaders were corrupt and inept. Who were their political leaders who were corrupt and inept? I could give you names, but don't. I won't. So they look back at their prior 15 or so years history, and they see who all their political leaders are, and they're all the young men who came out of relatively well-to-do circumstances. And so the question is asked, how did they become corrupted? Well, gee, I don't know. I don't remember. They must have become corrupted because their education wasn't adequate. Oh, well, who taught them? Who was responsible for teaching them? Well, gee, I don't know. But I do remember this play that I saw in the 420s called The Clouds. And in that play was Socrates. And Socrates in that play was an atheist. He denied the existence of the traditional gods, and he taught for money. Now remember, traditionally in Athenian society, money is a corrupting force, particularly in politics. So who corrupted the youth? Well, gee, it must have been Socrates. Well, let's get Socrates down here and ask him a few questions. So in 399, they put Socrates on trial. He's charged with the primary charge is that he corrupted the youth. The primary charge is that he taught atheism, and that by teaching atheism, he took the young men away from the traditional value system, and that in turn led to the corruption of the Athenian political system, and then that led to the downfall of Athens at the hands of Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. So they put him on trial. Okay. Now there's two good sources for this. There's more than two accounts, but the two primary sources are Plato. One of Plato's early works is called the Apology, and that's an account of Socrates' defense speech. And then another writer by the name of Xenophon also wrote an apology that gives an account of Socrates' speeches, and the two are different, and they're different in some fairly interesting ways, but that's not for us to talk about today. But in Plato's account of Socrates, Socrates, of course, is going to be his own lawyer. He's going to give his own defense speech. Now, we know in the American legal system, the cliche is that if you are your own lawyer, you have a bad lawyer. But in ancient Athens, things were a little bit different. If you were a citizen, it was a better thing if you could give your own defense speech. It was the best thing is if you could compose it, write it yourself. If you weren't capable of doing that, if you weren't a good writer, you could pay for somebody else to do it, but you would still be expected to memorize and deliver it. And if you couldn't do that, then you could have a representative stand up. But it's just kind of the opposite, right? You didn't want somebody else giving a speech, because if you have somebody else giving your speech, maybe you're guilty. If you were innocent, you'd be able to defend yourself. So anyway, Socrates gives his own. Make a long story short, Socrates gives his own defense speech. I'm not gonna get into too great detail over it. But he obviously denies the charges of being atheism, and basically says, well, listen, if any of you paid attention to anything I taught, you'd know I wasn't an atheist. And then he gets on to the democracy, and more or less he says that because he has lived in Athens his whole life, and because Athens has he's enjoyed the benefits of Athenian democracy over the years, that whatever the democracy decides, he'll abide by that decision. So they take a vote. and he is convicted, not by a large margin. It's a very close vote, but he is convicted, and he is sentenced to death. He's sentenced to execution because atheism is punishable by death under Athenian law. I think I talked a little bit about this with the clouds already, but I'll just repeat it briefly here. Athens is a city-state, a polis, whose foundational ideology is traced back to Athena and Poseidon. So Athena, the goddess of wisdom, the Athenians think of themselves as being really clever. And Poseidon, who is, of course, the god of the sea, and the Athenians not just think of themselves, but actually, in fact, were the dominant naval force throughout the Mediterranean through a long period, not the whole time, but through a long period of the classical era. So to deny the existence of the gods is to deny the basic legitimacy of the foundations of Athens itself. So it's a capital crime. So he's sentenced to die, and he, in the few days between his trial and his execution, he's put under house arrest. They didn't have prisons the way that we think of them, but people could be detained in closed spaces. But he was allowed to enjoy the company of his friends, again, many of whom were well connected and wealthy, who all basically said to Socrates, listen, we can get you out of the city. We have the means, we can sneak you out, and we'll make sure that nobody comes looking for you, just as long as you don't return. And again, Socrates said, no, I'm born Athenian, so whatever Athens has decided, I'll stick by. Bit of a martyr for the philosophical cause, I think. And so he is executed in 399. He's executed, not publicly, but privately. He is given a bowl of hemlock, which is a poisonous plant, which he drinks and he dies. Well, Plato never really got over this fact, or over the execution, and this will affect Plato's philosophy pretty fundamentally. So it's not just going to affect the way that he presents Socrates, which I'm going to wrap up here in just a second, but it also is going to affect his own political philosophy, which is going to be the topic of our next discussion. Okay, so when we look at this fundamentally, you can see some basic differences between the presentation. Oh, and also, too, the other thing is Plato never got over blaming Aristophanes and the other comic poets for slandering Socrates, because he felt that formed the public opinion of Socrates and led to his trial and his execution. And he wouldn't say that he's wrong entirely. So in Aristophanes, Socrates is an atheist, and he's a sophist who teaches for money. In Plato, he's in fact actually religious. As we see at the very start of the Republic, they're returning from a religious festival. So one of the first things that Plato wants us to think about Socrates is that he is involved in the religious life of the city, not that he denies it, or that he denied it. And then, of course, in Plato, Socrates does not have a school, and he does not take money for teaching. He takes the occasional chicken or a cloak, but he doesn't have a formal school, and he doesn't charge tuition to, hear what he has to say. So one more thing that I want to point out here. We remember back to the clouds, and we remember the result of Plato's, the second half of the clouds, where Plato, we have the argument between worse logic and better logic, and worse logic wins. So Pheidippides is educated by worse logic, and towards the end of the play, we see what effect that has on him. It has a corrupting effect. He ends up physically abusing his own father, which is way out of bounds, and even threatens to physically abuse his mother, and won't help his dad in his dad's legal troubles. So what we see in Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates, he's an atheist, he teaches for money, so he's a sophist, and the net effect of the education from Socrates is that it corrupts young men. So again, going back to the trial of Socrates, what were the charges? He taught atheism, and through teaching atheism, that corrupted the young men who would later go on to become civic figures. But it's different in the Republic. So not only does Plato want us to understand that Socrates was not an atheist, he also wants us to understand that he was not a corrupting influence on young men. How does he show us this? Now we can talk about let's get into the dialogue proper now. So I've already mentioned they're coming back from a religious festival. They're walking up the hill. They get hailed by Polemarchus, who brings them back to the house. They go back to the house. And now we meet Kephalos. The old man, who is hosting on this day a discussion, a philosophical little symposium, basically, amongst other Athenian citizens. Now Kephalos is old. In fact, he has two defining features. He's old and he's rich. And I'll talk about those two things in just a second. But let me just wrap up with with our discussion of the two Socrateses that we have, one in Aristophanes and one in Plato. What Kephalos says to Socrates is that, again, I can't come up to Athens anymore, but you should visit more often, he says, and you should come and have conversations with these young men. In other words, what Kephalos is asking of Socrates is, come and teach my son. So what we see is that not only is Socrates, not only does Plato, not only is he keen to make us understand that he was not atheist, but rather he was involved in the religious life of the city. He also wants us to see that he was not seen as a corrupting force on young men, but rather that he was sought out as a teacher. So think about this for a second. We've got three characters involved here: Kephalos, Socrates, and Polemarchus. Kephalos is old. Socrates is middle-aged at this stage, probably about in his 40s or so, in 427. And Polemarchus is a younger man, probably a man in his mid-20s or so. So Kephalos, the old man, wants Socrates to come and teach his son Polemarchus. So the older generation, of course, then as now, is associated with traditional values, traditional ideas. So what Plato wants us to think about in this scenario is that even the older, more traditional generation of Athenians valued Socrates' teaching and wanted him to come and teach the young men. Therefore, these two charges at the trial are bogus. He was neither atheist, nor was he a corrupting force on the young men. So fundamental differences between Aristophanes Socrates and Plato Socrates. But again, just to reiterate, they are both. That doesn't mean that just because the Socrates of Plato is a more sober, serious kind of character, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily getting 100% accurate portrayal of the historical Socrates. Again, there's degrees here. Okay, so let's get into the actual conversation that they have and move this along already. I'm already at 40 minutes. Kephalos is old and rich. So what Socrates says is, asks him about getting old. And he says, it must suck to be getting old. And Kephalos' response is quite humorous. There is actually, in fact, a lot of humor in Plato's portrayal of Socrates. It's not the same kind of humor that we have in Aristophanes, Nobody poops themselves in Plato. At least I don't think so. Not that I can remember. But there's Socrates was famous for his ironia, his Socratic irony, um, uh, which at times comes a lot closer to what we think of as sarcasm um, than irony, as we've discussed it, like say with Sophocles. So Socrates says, Cephalos, you're getting old. That must really suck to get old. Like just can't do what you used to be able to do as a young man. And Cephalos says, no, actually, it's not that bad. He says, oh, being old, yeah, it comes with some difficulties. But he says one of the things it does is it frees you. It frees you from being a slave to physical pleasure. What Cephalos says is that as you get old, your sexual desire lessens, and he compares. He actually quotes a line from Sophocles, one of Sophocles' lost plays, uh, and he compares it to being freed. He compares it to being a slave that suddenly gets freed from its master. So your sexual desire goes away. You're no longer a slave to it. So it's a kind of a freedom. So it's sort of a blessing in disguise. At which point Socrates says, well, you're only saying that because you're rich. If you were poor, you'd probably find it a lot more difficult in your old age. But because you're rich, you can afford all the luxuries and to ease your own life. And what Cephalos' response to that is, well, okay, fair enough, but he says that's not really. Cephalos responds that that's not really uh, the central issue. He says what's really the central issue is in the translation that I assigned. It's translated as reasonable. We could translate it equally as sane or level-headed. Um, so Cephalos' response is, look, if I were still rich, but I was unreasonable, irrational, not level headed, I would find getting old extremely difficult. Whereas if I were poor, but still rational, still reasonable, still level headed, I would find it bearable, just as I do now. So, what's the point of this conversation? So, Cephalos, whose name means head or brain, is trying to point. So the point of why he is made to be an old man in the dialogue is to call attention to the ideas of whether or not answers to our happiness can be found in the physical realm, which Cephalos says no, and whether or not our happiness can be found in the possession of material, money, things. So what Plato is doing here is he's prepping our brains. He's clearing our cephalos here so that we understand right off the bat in the dialogue that whatever questions we ask the answers are not going to be found either in the physical realm or in the material realm. That means our thoughts have to be guided toward the abstract. Okay, so here's our first big leap in philosophy. Whatever we talk about in philosophy, or in Plato, I should say, whatever questions we ask, whatever answer we're looking for, we're not going to find that answer in the physical realm or the material realm. It can only be found in the realm of the abstract. Okay? Why? Because things that are in the physical realm and the material realm decay and go away. They're not permanent. So when we ask a question about an idea, a question like, what is justice? Any answer that we try to provide which relies on reference to the physical realm or the material realm is going to be inadequate, because what we're looking here, what Plato is seeking here, are abstract ideals. He's looking for answers that are permanent, perfect, permanent and perfect. So perfect means doesn't need it. It's totally self-contained. It's everything you need is contained within that definition. You don't need any qualifiers outside of it. And permanent means it never changes. Okay. And obviously, things in the physical and material realm change, and therefore they cannot be considered as completely satisfactory answers to questions about abstracted ideas such as justice. Okay. So obviously, you know where I'm going with this. This is the question that is asked. Kefalos says, what I worry about is, he says, well, there's one thing I do worry about as I get older. It's about when I die and about what's going to happen to me in the next world, whether I'm going to receive a reward or be punished for my actions, for my lifetime activities. In other words, what he says is, I worry about whether or not I have been a just person over the course of my life and how that will affect my afterlife. So that's what introduces Socrates saying, well, what is justice? How would we even figure that out? Kefalos' definition is a simple one. He says, justice is to pay back what you owe. You borrow something from somebody, you give it back. You take out a loan, you pay it back. So you, in other words, you have to be a person of your word, and you give in kind what you have received. So simply to pay back what you owe, to pay back your debts. Right. Well, this is not Socrates doesn't like this definition. So Socrates points out that this definition is inadequate, and his counter argument to this is, well, what if you lend your friend a sword, and then your friend loses his mental faculties, and then takes that sword. So, okay, let me start again. The argument here is that, like, so you have a friend, right, and you lend your friend your sword, and then your friend returns the sword to you. And so all right. So forget about the sword for a second, because let's modernize this a little bit. Let's say that you for whatever reason feel as if you need to keep a gun at home. Okay, you feel threatened, or you just would feel more safe at home if you had a gun there, right? So your friend has a couple of guns, so you go to your friend and you say, look, can you lend me a gun? I would just feel safer at home if I had kept this gun at home. And your friend says, sure, I totally understand. He gives you the gun. You take the gun home. You put it in the shoebox, put it under your bed. But it worries you. And so you're like, well, I'm not comfortable having a gun in my home. So you take the gun and you give it back to your friend. You return it to him or her. That's justice, right? You've taken something and you've paid back what you owed. That would be justice according to Kefalos' definition. But then you're riding on the subway one day, and somebody walks on your new sneaks, and you're pissed, right? So you go to your friend and you say, "Give me the gun back. I need the gun back. This guy walked on my new sneakers, and I'm gonna go, shoot him." And so, under Kefalos' definition of justice, that would, in some senses, fit the definition of justice, right? And but is that really justice? Would shooting somebody over your damaged sneakers be considered justice? Doesn't seem right. Okay, so the problem with Kefalos' definition of justice is that, in fact, if we followed Kefalos' simple definition of justice, of paying back what you owe, you would actually end up employing a definition of justice that would result in injustice. Okay, I don't care how much you paid for your sneakers. It isn't justice for you to go shoot somebody who put a scuff mark on them, right? We can all generally agree as a principle that that's an unjust thing to do. So we're working here on a very simple philosophical principle that I'm going to explain here. It's central to understanding Socrates' logic in the Republic. When we do philosophy, we have to be very careful to define the terms that we use as well as the logical principles that we're following in argument. This is a very simple logical principle, a very fundamental one. It is that a thing, any one thing, that means a concept or a quality, hot or cold, just or unjust, it can't be hot and cold at the same time and still be one thing. So it can't be thing A, like justice, and also at the same time be thing not A. That's unjustice, right? So Kephalos' definition is faulty, according to Socrates, because by his definition, you would get the definition of justice producing an act of injustice or injustice, right? And we know that it can't be justice and injustice at the same time. It's a logical contradiction. If I have a coffee, my coffee cannot be hot and cold at the same time. Okay. Yes, I could put milk in it and that would make it warm, but then it's not one thing anymore. It's not just coffee anymore. It's coffee and milk. So it's two things that produce a new quality within it. Okay? So coffee is either hot or cold, but not both at the same time. So it can't be hot and cold at the same time. So Kephalos' definition of justice is faulty, according to Socrates. So at that point, Kephalos says, I'm getting kind of sleepy. I got to go lay down for my afternoon nap. And then he says to his son Polemarchos, you take the conversation over for me. Socrates makes a crack about this being Polemarchos' greatest inheritance from his father. So another jab at Kephalos being rich. Okay, so Polemarchos picks up the conversation at this point, and he offers a refined definition of justice. And his definition of justice is to do good to your friends and do harm to your enemies. This is Polemarchos' refined definition of justice. Do good to your friends and do harm to your enemies, which is an argument, again, that Socrates rejects, and he rejects it he rejects it because it's basically the same argument as his dad's argument. All he's done is instead of simply saying pay back what you owe, he's just refined it into saying, well, you owe good things to your friends and you owe bad things to your enemies. So it's really the same definition of justice, just in fancier terms. So again, this is rejected by Socrates for the same reason, that you would have justice producing injustice under this definition. Why? Because we can't know who our friends and our enemies are, really. I'm sure we all have experience of thinking somebody is a friend only to find out that they don't have our best interests at heart. Sorry, I always start too far to the right on the page, and so if I run out of space, and then run off the end of the page. So yes, my table is covered in magic marker. So the problem with Kephalos' definition, Polemarchos' definition, is that since we can't really know who means us good and means us harm, that therefore we can't know who to do good to and who to do bad to. So we might end up doing good things to people who are bad, and we might end up doing bad things to people who are good. So we can confuse who our friends and our enemies are. My favorite example of this, the one I use often to explain this principle, is me. So, I give you an exam and you fail your exam, or you write a paper and I give it back to you and your paper comes back with a C minus, let's say. And you think, oh, that guy hates me. What a jerk. He just doesn't like me, i.e., he's my enemy. So then you go online and you say all kinds of nasty things about me. And then there's a second paper due after that. So you're like, I'm going to show him. So you go back, that stupid Professor Pletcher. I'm going to show him that I can really write a good paper. So you go back to the first paper and you go back through it and you look at the comments that I put on the paper, and incorporate those comments in the second paper, and then you hand in your second paper and you get an A. So was I your enemy before? No, I was not your enemy. Even though you thought I was trying in that hypothetical situation. Now, of course, you're all going to get A's. Psych. But in that original situation, you would think, this guy doesn't like me. He's my enemy. He's out to harm me. So I'm going to harm him back. That's Polemarchos' definition. I harm you, you harm me back. That's justice, right? But as it turns out, I was not your enemy. And so what you ended up doing was harming your friend, which makes this Polemarchos' definition of justice not perfect. It's not perfect because it's a definition of justice that will produce injustice. Therefore, it fails the ideal, the test of ideality, right? It's also not abstract because, just like his dad's definition, it largely has to do with exchange of material goods, paying things back to somebody else. Okay, so this is not the last. So Polemarchos is not the only guy at the party. There's another guy at the party whose name is Thrasymachos. Now, Thrasymachos, as Plato was fond of doing, not always, but frequently in his dialogues, he uses actual historical people, okay, like Socrates, like Glaucon, but also this character, Thrasymachos. Thrasymachos butts into the conversation rather rudely, as Socrates says, "You're attacking me like a rabid wolf," because Thrasymachos says, "Oh, Socrates, stop with this nonsense. All you ever do is ask questions, and then when people give answers, you poke holes in them, but you never ever give any answers." He says, "So you tell us, Socrates. Tell us right now. What do you think justice is? You give us your definition of justice, and see if we can poke holes in it." At which point you get a good example of what I referenced earlier, which is Socrates' irony, or in some ways of reading Socrates' sarcasm. Because Thrasymachos says to Socrates, "You tell us what justice is." He says, "And don't give us any of this nonsense about good or bad. Don't give us any of this nonsense about paying back debts. Just tell us what your definition is." When Socrates says, "My goodness, Thrasymachos, oh, calm down, buddy. Don't be so excited." He says, "You ask me to give a definition of justice, but then you tell me all the things I can't say." Socrates says, "That's like you asking me, how much is the number 12? And don't tell me it's 6 plus 6. And don't tell me it's 3 times 4. If you take all my options away, how can I give you a definition?" Thrasymachos. So I'll tell you what, why don't you tell us what you think justice is, and we'll discuss that instead. So Thrasymachos, who comes in all gangbusters and all hot and heavy about trying to finally pin Socrates down, soon finds himself very rapidly backed into a corner. A logical corner by Socrates, where what he was demanding is now what he has to provide, which is his definition of justice. But this is not a problem for Thrasymachos, because he's really confident that he knows what justice is. In actual fact, he really doesn't think justice is anything at all. He thinks that what justice is that those who are strong rule over the weak. In other words, justice is just a label. It's just a word that in and of itself doesn't have any. It doesn't correspond to anything that actually exists. It's just a convenient label that people who have power can slap onto their actions, and then the people who don't have power accept that as a just action, right? They accept it as justice because the label's been put off, like slapped onto it. So the word justice itself doesn't have any meanings. As you might have guessed already, that makes Thrasymachos an actual, honest to goodness, real life sophist. Because if you remember back to Thucydides, one of the things that Thucydides is trying to warn us about is when words start to lose their meaning. Because when words start to lose their meaning, they can be employed by people who maybe don't have the general interest at heart. Maybe they only have their own private self-interest at heart. And they can use those in different situations so that we're misguided, we're misdirected, right? Think about remember when we talked about the plague in Athens and the oracle came, or they dug up that old oracle that said when the plague hits Athens, there will be a mass death. But the problem was they weren't quite sure about the original wording of the oracle, so it might have actually said there will be a mass famine. And Thucydides says this is basically what happens when words begin to change their meanings. They can be exploited for private circumstances and private benefit. Okay, so this is logos. You should remember that term because I did talk an awful lot about it with Thucydides. So what Thrasymachos says is that people who have power um, employ that power for their own benefit. He says nobody. He basically says, Socrates, you're so naive. Like you're not even in the real world, right? You're in this realm of abstracted ideas. Nobody lives in that world. We live in the real world. Nobody does things so that they benefit other people. They do things primarily because it benefits them. Now, yes, sometimes people do things and it does end up benefiting other people, but that's not the motivation they get into. Basically, Thrasymachos' argument is nobody goes into politics to benefit the society as a whole. They go into politics because they want power and money. Likewise, nobody goes into medicine to heal the sick. They go into medicine because it's a lucrative profit. Nobody raises sheep so that the sheep can be happy and healthy. They raise sheep to sell and make money for themselves. And you're naive if you think otherwise about this. I'm sure there are some of you out there who agree with Thrasymachos. But let's look at Socrates' counter-argument to this before you make up your minds. Socrates' counter-argument to this is that, again, this fails the justice producing injustice argument. So there's that, but there's more to it than that. Because Socrates engages with this idea of why people go into certain professions or pursue certain avenues, which Thrasymachos says is only for their benefit, and if anybody else benefits from it, then that's all well and good. But that the primary reason is that you're doing it for your benefit. So Socrates' counterargument to this is I'll use I'll use two examples. One that Socrates uses. Well, actually, they're both ones that Socrates uses. Let's start with the shepherd. Let's start with the guy who has a sheep farm. When the shepherd raises his sheep, right, he has to raise sheep that are healthy, woolly, chubby. So, in his art or skill as a shepherd, the primary beneficiary of that is not the farmer. It's the sheep. It's the sheep who benefit primarily from the shepherd's skill. Now, yeah, is the shepherd going to take the wool off and sell it at market? Is he going to slaughter some of the sheep and sell the meat at market? Probably. Is he going to make money from it? Probably. I'll come back to that in just a second. But primarily, when you practice your skill or your art, the benefit doesn't primarily go to you. It goes to what you are producing, what you are making. So let's take the doctor for a second. The doctor example. When the doctor practices her art or her skill, who benefits from that? Don't say the insurance companies, because okay, say the insurance companies. Forget the insurance companies for a minute. When you go to the doctor's office and you got a sprained ankle or whatever, and the doctor wraps your ankle, who benefits from that primarily? Does the doctor benefit from that? No. Not in the actual practice of the medicine itself. Is the doctor getting paid? Probably by the hospital or by the clinic or whatever. But in the actual practice of the skill, you, the patient, benefit from it. So what Socrates is talking about is this concept, the techne. So techne is usually translated as skill or art or craft. What it is any kind of productive activity, anything that you do that makes something, whether that be raising sheep, whether that be making shoes, whether that be practicing medicine. But the point, Socrates' argument here is that anybody who actually truly possesses a skill or an art, anybody who knows how to do something and why it should be done. So knowledge is central here to Socrates' concept of techne. You go to the doctors because you have a cold, and the doctor prescribed you some medicine, and you go out and you take the medicine and you get better, right? So the doctor performed her skill, and you benefited from it. But you get a cold and you come to me and you say, I have a cold, and I say to you, oh my goodness, I have this great recipe for chicken soup. It was my grandma's recipe for chicken soup. Let me give it to you. And I give you the recipe, and you go home and you make the chicken soup and you eat it and drink the broth, and next day you feel much better, right? Does that make me a doctor? Does that mean I have a doctor's skill? I don't think so. So in Socrates, the techne is embedded in forms of knowledge, and specifically knowledge of not just how to do something. It's not just knowing how to bandage up somebody's sprained ankle or how to make chicken soup, but it's also the why of that skill. In other words, it's internal logic, why it works, why it's effective. Okay? So Socrates' counter-argument to Thrasymachos is that what Thrasymachos is talking about is that Socrates' counter-argument is that Thrasymachos has confused two different ideas here. He's confused the idea of possessing a skill, a techne, with the idea of making money, making profit. So let's go back to the sheep now. If I'm a shepherd and I'm really good at raising sheep, right? All my sheep are chubby, healthy, and woolly, best sheep in the town. Does that automatically guarantee that I'm going to be able to make a profit off of those sheep? Does that automatically mean I'm going to be able to sell the wool or sell the meat at a profit? It does not. Because what if none of my neighbors like me? What if I suck at business? So there's the techne of raising sheep. There's a techne of shepherding, but then there's also this other kind of activity, which is the techne of marketing, of being able to sell things. So it's actually two different skills. Now, I don't want to go too deep into this, but you can probably already guess Socrates doesn't really think very highly of the techne of selling stuff, making money. But again, so let's go back to the doctor. If the techne is knowledge of the how and why, that means the very best doctors. That means the best doctors are the most skilled doctors. If Thrasymachos' definition of justice were correct, it would logically follow that the best doctors are also, therefore, the richest doctors. Because, according to Thrasymachos, nobody learns how to do anything except to profit themselves. So it stands to reason, it stands to logic that the people who are best at something will also, therefore, be the richest of that particular kind of thing. Well, you can see, I hope you can see, that this is clearly a very, I suppose, just to use a nice term, a very cynical definition of justice, whereby, again, the actual concept of justice doesn't mean anything, right? It's just this sticker, it's just this label that people who know how to do things can slap onto their actions. Now, I've used the examples of the shepherd and the physician, but where we're going with this, of course, is a discussion of political philosophy. So what Thrasymachos is actually saying is that nobody goes into government except to profit themselves, except to consolidate their own power and their own wealth. So it would stand to reason also, therefore, that our best public leaders would also be the wealthiest of our public leaders. Bernie 2020. When we think about the doctors for a second, if we think that if we go with Thrasymachos' definition that the best doctors are also the wealthiest doctors, we would have to come to the logical conclusion that the best doctors are Beverly Hills plastic surgeons, because they're the richest, right? And for Thrasymachos, your personal wealth, or in the terms of politics, your personal power, is a direct indication of your possession of a techne or a skill. I don't think I need to produce a counter argument to that. I think we can all generally agree that the best doctors are the ones who do works in public clinics or in underserviced areas. And they're never the richest. They're never the wealthiest. So, yeah, okay. So that's all I want to talk about for today. We went through the definitions of justice. Remember, again, sophists, Thrasymachos is a sophist. The sophists, one of the common stereotypes about the sophists was that they could manipulate words to fit any situation, and that's exactly what Thrasymachos is doing here in this argument. He's just taking this word justice and saying you can manipulate it to fit any situation. It doesn't mean anything in its own right. Much the same as the worse argument teaches Pheidippides to manipulate words and manipulate arguments. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. I hope that you are all well. Yeah, bye.